Major aspect of RPG design and customization is the act of creating different playstyles, classes, jobs, builds, whatever. And for today's critical thought, we're going to discuss the building of builds and why it's a lot harder than you may think just to pump more damage or more strategy into your game. With all the work I've been doing for my RPG book and playing a lot more RPGs of all varieties, we've had a chance to see different ways of creating different playstyles, classes, and whatever. And this is an integral aspect of the RPG progression system, where you're going to be creating different playstyles, aka jobs, classes, or whatever, that are going to fit either essential roles in your game or act as different win conditions or win solutions for whatever your game may be. And when you're trying to determine not only how to design a build but also balance it, it all has to go back to a very simple point. How does someone win in your game? Do they win by doing the most damage, getting to the end of a level, and any other weird or unusual ways that you can think of? Well, of course, the most common one is damage. If I hit the boss harder than they hit me, I win. It's a shocking development, I know. But once you figure this out, you then need to take this to the next level and figure out, how do we facilitate that win condition? And the reason I start with damage is it's a very simple thing to understand. But it can get very complicated when we talk about all the different kinds of damage. Direct damage, damage over time, quick attacks, glass cannons, heavy attacks, DOTs, burning, fire, poison, ice. Anything that you can imagine can be a form of damage, and we've seen that in varieties of ARPGs and strategy or tactical style RPG design. But it does again raise that challenge when it comes to balancing different playstyles. Because at the end of the day, if everyone can do 10 million points of damage in a single hit, there's no real choice there. Everyone is really powerful, but it once again falls back to numbers beating numbers in a number fight. Conversely, if something is too weak or it doesn't apply the necessary condition to win, then why should someone take it? Why should someone take 15 extra turns to kill an enemy when this build kills it in 2? Put a card down, hit the enemy, I win. And this becomes harder and harder to balance when you're dealing with fundamentally different characters, classes, factions, whatever. So a good example of this would be the stuff that we see in games like Slay the Spire and Monster Train, where each character, or in Monster Train's case, each faction, is its own unique playstyle. It has its own specific win condition. Or in Slay the Spire's case, each character has usually 2 to 3. If I'm playing as the Ironclad, I can go for a powering my strength up strategy, making all my cards stronger so they hit harder. I could also go for a block-based strategy using Juggernaut. I would go for a strategy where I'm doing damage to myself and trying to proc or synergize off of that. And then what they did in Monster Train was that, again, every faction has one unique gimmick to it. The Demon faction gets Rage, which enhances its cards. The Plant faction gets Thorn or Reflect damage, and we go down the line. So the challenge is that each faction has a specific win condition, or a way to power their cards up to obscene levels. How you do that each run greatly differs based on what cards you get, what passive you get access to, and of course what your secondary faction is. So if I combine Thorns with the Wick faction, or the Candle one, I can create a lot of cheap units that just bounce back damage very effectively. And this creates a lot of variance and ways of playing. Now, an issue that we run into, though, is when something is either too good, or, again, it takes too many steps to make it viable. And this was an issue that we ran into with stuff like the Darkest Dungeon. And in the Darkest Dungeon, the game received many different passives and reworks of its skills over the course of the game's early access and into 1.0. A lot that was done was to weaken characters and remove some of the more spikier combinations. For any Darkest Dungeon fan who remembers the Jester's finale, just being super powerful and just killing everyone. The finale in the original version was the one turn strategy. We don't wait till the end, we just do it right at the start. And that was heavily nerfed. It had to be then built up over multiple turns and then hit that guy. But you see, here's the problem. Again, when you're looking at the win condition for your game and how to facilitate that, anything that is either longer, riskier, or just plain awkward to do is always going to be less viable and less of a choice to players compared to bread and butter. Again, it goes back to the JRPG design and the tropes of, we can give you all these different buffs and debuffs, but A, they are completely useless against bosses, and B, most of the time it's just better to hit something with a giant sword or a hammer and kill it outright. And with Darkest Dungeon, part of that issue was the limitations of non-damage related skills. That again, why should I spend a turn to buff my characters that may only last 2 turns and could not even be that big of a buff, or just let that guy smack the enemy? And this was, interestingly, one of the things that was kind of shifted and altered in the fan-made expansion, the Black Reliquary, that we tried out last week, or a few weeks ago, depending on when this video goes up. Where what they did was they introduced a prep phase that's kind of like a turn 0, that both you and the enemies can spend buffing and applying debuffs before the actual battle goes off. And while I don't think it's the most elegant solution, it is a solution to how do we give the player an ability that could be useful, but it takes away a precious turn. Now, an example that I ran into that it didn't feel quite right to me is when we played Dungeons of Aether, which was kind of the inspiration for this video. This is a kind of, I guess it's a RPG dice game, where every turn the game will roll dice of various colors that correspond to different skills, and then you place the dice where you want that will impact the quality or the impact of that attribute. So the first character in the game is kind of like your bread and butter, general, master, jack of all trades, master of none kind of approach. Once you beat that first chapter, the game introduces the 3 other characters who each have their own unique spin or take on the rules. And this is where I lost a lot of interest in the game, and where a lot of the fan base really churned. You can see this looking at the achievement rates of everyone who cleared Chapter 1 versus Chapter 2. And the reason, at least from my impression, is that it felt like instead of introducing a different way of playing or a different style, it felt like I'm being handicapped by the design of the game. So here's what happened. The first character you get introduced in Chapter 2 is a pirate shark-like character, who their special passive is that all defensive dice automatically roll 1. So this is a character that's not supposed to be something you're supposed to block. Instead, you're supposed to be relying on dodge. In order to get dodge, you need to have a secondary resource at least 3, and you have to make sure that your speed is higher in a lot of cases in order to proc some of his special or their special talents. So here's the problem. When you remove or when you change like an essential feature in a game like this, again, the ability to block, it needs to be replaced with something comparable or different. That, again, we're not talking about comparing apples to apples. This is like comparing, or should be like, apples to trucks. That if you're going to go for very different play styles, they need to feel legitimately different. The problem that I ran into with Dungeons of Aether is that even though this character features different abilities, it's all still fed through that same filter. If I need to attack, I need strength dice. If I want to be able to use a skill, I need accuracy dice. And it just felt like the amount of time it took to do something cool with this character is magnitudes longer and riskier, especially in a game where everyone only has like 3 to 4 health points compared to that first character. Now, when we contrast this with stuff like Monster Train Slay the Spire, yes, the Silent is not going to hit as hard as the Ironclad. But they have their own strategy. You can go shivs, you can go poison. So that, again, it's not about kind of filtering everything through the same playstyle, but presenting different and, again, very important, viable ways of playing. And as I said a few minutes ago, you don't want something to be seen as more cumbersome or fiddly, because that's not what people want to play, especially if you have a character who is better, faster, and safer to go through. And the worst part with Dungeon of Aether is that you're forced to do this, because the Chapter 2 formats you have to play through as each one of the 3 new characters. So it had that situation again where if the enemy just pulls a lot of attack dice, and I can't build up the necessary means of dodging, if let's say it's only defense dice that show up, I can't do anything. Like, it becomes that case where I can win, but it's going to be a far more annoying and cumbersome time compared to other characters. And this is where you have to be very careful and considerate when it comes to how you create different builds. Because if you're going to do something different, make it really different. As I said, you don't want to be comparing characters very similarly. You want to have characters or strategies that are fundamentally different. So with the Shark example, a better way, I think, in my opinion, to kind of emphasize this character being based on speed or dodging could be, let's say, instead of relying on strength dice to attack, maybe they get a modifier based on the number of speed dice. Because this is a way that you're fundamentally changing how someone plays a game built off of your existing framework. But you're doing it in a way that it doesn't feel like you're just saying like the same character and just moving them either this way or this way on the kind of design spectrum. Because like we've said, when you can compare characters directly like that, if one character is better than everyone else, why should everyone play those other characters? And this takes us to that greater discussion when it comes to balancing games based on meta play and meta design that we do not have the time to get to here. We'll be here for another 20 to 30 minutes. But to begin to wrap things up, when you're balancing or trying to create different play styles, again, they all have to facilitate or be facilitated by what is the goal of this game? And then to take that to another point, how do you win? Can you win by being faster than your opponent? By being able to take more damage instead of giving it? If you can, then those are viable options. But if you design a final boss that, let's say, has armor piercing, so all attacks are basically cannot be blocked by defense, having a character who specializes in blocking and defending would be pointless. This goes back to one of my older examples when it comes to false choices. Having a fire build and then introducing a boss or entire section that every enemy is fire immune. You don't want to punish the player for trying out different strategies or different builds. Because you see, here's the big point about this. Every build, every character class, job, whatever you put into your game, the consumer is going to assume that they are viable from beginning to middle to end. And if they're not, and if they choose that one character or that one class that you didn't balance enough, and let's say it completely falls apart 75% through the game, most people are not going to say, well, you know what, let's just restart the whole game with another character. They're going to write, this game is busted, GG developers, refund, negative review it. And you need to, again, be very considerate when you design unique or different approaches, because those aspects can add or detract from your game. If you, again, design some crazy buff skill that it works on your characters, and let's say it completely invalidates everything else in the game, again, why should someone take something differently? And this is, again, why a lot of developers, especially, again, RPG designers, they become very worried about having weird or unique abilities that interact in ways that they don't either plan for, or that they feel may invalidate or completely ruin the end. It's why so many bosses and final fights, the enemy just flat out is immune to everything. Or you design a way that, hey, you've been using poison this whole time. Well, now the boss is completely immune to it. And this was one of the kind of faults in Slay the Spire, that depending on the final boss that you got, certain builds were 100% shut down. You got be a Time Eater when you're using a Shiv-based strategy as a silent, you're done. Like, there is no playing around that when you have a boss specifically designed to counter, like, rapid card use, and your build is all about playing lots and lots of cards each turn. And again, you need to be very aware of how your builds, how your different skills and spells and weapons and all that are going to work all across your game. And as a kind of final point, some developers will just say, screw it. If the player somehow stacks 80 points of bleed and damage, and they get the passive that multiplies all bleed by 50 more points, and they just go, boop, and the final boss dies immediately, let them do that. This is kind of the Edmund McMillan approach, or what he was trying to do with some of the Binding of Isaac updates. And again, it really depends on the kind of game you're trying to build, and again, what are the choices and options you're trying to create for it. If there is that super game-breaking strategy that requires the perfect combination of artifacts and cards and the right gear, and if all these planets align and allow someone to break the game, it may just be fine to let them, because what's the chance of that happening run after run, choice after choice? Now, if it's something that, again, the entire complexity is, I choose skill B, I have item C, I'm unstoppable, then you may want to adjust or nerf that. But the ultimate universal advice that developers will give is that if there is something that is considered too powerful, it's often better to try and buff or enhance the options that people aren't choosing, rather than try and make something that people like and make it weaker. Because if you take something that everyone likes and you make it to the point that it's useless, what else are they going to have to do with your game? Or what other options are they going to have if you just remove their favorite one? And this doesn't mean that you can't design encounters or specific situations to be spiky. Have a character who, let's say, punishes you for using bleed, or punishing you for using debuffs. But you need to make that explicitly clear to the player, and if you are going to go that route, then you need to have ways for the player to be able to adjust either on the fly or before a fight. The more weight there is to a player's decision or the abilities in the game, the more you need to make sure that those are available or they are viable. If you're playing like an 80 to 100 hour long RPG and you build an entire skill tree around poison, damage over time, weakening enemies, and so on, and then at the 79-hour mark, we introduce an entire dungeon where everyone is immune to it or they punish you for that, and there's no way to change, people are going to despise that game. And it's oftentimes why we see for a lot of games today, especially the action RPGs and kind of mobile-style RPGs, the means to quickly change things around. If party member A, B, and C don't work, let me just pop back to a menu, swap them out for D, E, and F. If these skills don't work, let me put these on. You can still have decision-making and advanced choices, but you're not punishing the player for making a wrong choice or having to adapt on the fly. So, for my final question for today's video, can you think of games that did an exceptional job of creating character, class, build diversity, whatever? And how did they make it so that the game was balanced on you having all these crazy cool powers without reducing or just taking away them at specific points? Let me know in the comments down below. Do the liking, bell ringing, and all that. Check out our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.